be able to shortly start the webinar. Hello, everyone, dear participants. On behalf of the experts in international trade at the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal, we welcome you to our webinar of the Desjardins International Meeting Series. Today's topic is the general outlook on climate finance with the spotlight on the US market and global opportunities under Joe Biden's presidency. My name is Nicholas Garreau, and I'm a coordinator for international projects at the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal. I am very pleased to animate this webinar with you today. Our speakers today are Mr. Matthew McCracken, Trade Commissioner with Global Affairs Canada in Ottawa, focusing on international financial institutions and global climate finance. We have the pleasure to welcome as well Mr. Faheem Noor, who is a Climate Finance Trade Commissioner, also with Global Affairs Canada, but is based out of the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. I would like to use this time to thank our partners, starting with Desjardins, our principal sponsor, our collaborator, La Presse, who made this webinar possible, and Economic Development Agency of Canada for the regions of Quebec for its ongoing support to our World Trade Center's Montreal activities. If you have any questions for our panelists during the webinar, please write them in the designated Q&A box located on the bottom center of your screen, and we will address them towards the end of the webinar. You may ask your questions in the official language of your choosing, and I will be happy to translate for you if needed. Veuillez prendre note que ce webinaire est principalement en anglais. Toutefois, si vous avez des questions en français, vous pouvez également les poser, et puis il nous fera plaisir de les traduire et de les transmettre à nos panélistes. You may have seen a short survey on your screen, which we invite you to complete. You will also receive tomorrow a follow-up email from Zoom that will contain the presentation as well as virtual visit cards to reach out to our partners who will assist you with your international development projects. Vous avez dû voir un court sondage sur votre écran que nous vous invitons à remplir. Vous recevrez également demain un email de suivi qui contiendra les présentations ainsi que des cartes de visite pour contacter nos partenaires. Also, if you'd like to watch this webinar again, we will make the recording available on the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal website, as well as our YouTube channel. So let me start by introducing our first speaker, Matthew McCracken. Matthew is a trade commissioner covering the international financial institutions based at Global Affairs Canada in Ottawa. He is responsible for managing projects related to the African Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, European bilateral development agencies, and private investment funds. Prior to this, Matthew served at Treasury Board Secretariat, worked on South Asian commercial relations in Ottawa, Mumbai, and New Delhi. Matthew also worked in the infrastructure sector practice at Global Affairs in Ottawa. Matthew has graduated from Université de Montréal with a MSc in 2009, focusing on Canadian investment in emerging markets. Matthew has spent most of his career working on advancing Canadian commercial interest in emerging markets and developing countries. Our second speaker today is Mr. Faheem Noor, who is a Climate Finance Trade Commissioner with Global Affairs Canada, based in Washington, D.C. Faheem's role is to connect Canadian projects developers with development finance institutions, such as the International Finance Corporation, IFC, or the IDB Invest for funding of climate-friendly emerging market projects. Before joining the Trade Commissioner Service, Faheem has led Tanzania's Agribusiness Innovation Center in realizing revenue for the first time in its history, while developing a cohort of investable entrepreneurs. Faheem also led climate technology, entrepreneurship, and access to finance initiatives at the World Bank and IFC, and developed innovations program within the institutions. During that time, he also started co-developing and sold a food tech startup that focused on the shared economy. Finally, Faheem is a graduate of the Queen's University School of Business and Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. So I will allow now Matthew to have the floor, and I wish you a great webinar. Thank you very much. Matthew, if you can take on. I think Matthew might have disconnected. So what I would maybe do instead, in the meantime, if we're able to have Matthew back, Faheem, I will allow you to have the floor if you're okay with this.
Sure, thank you. Let me share my screen 1 second.
Thank you. I will see what's going on with Matthew. I'll be right back.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you to the Chamber of Commerce for having me. I really appreciate it. And this is an opportunity for me to share my perspectives on U.S. climate finance. So Nicholas provided a brief introduction of myself, so I won't focus on the slide too much. I do work out of the Embassy of Canada in Washington, D.C. I am a climate finance trade commissioner based here. I have 3 other colleagues that are climate finance trade commissioners strategically placed in different cities around the world close to the MDBs, or multilateral development banks. So I have a colleague in London, Rachel, who I believe has spoken to this audience. Ulodge is in West Africa, and Grimmy is in Manila. So we all cover a portion of the world. I'm somewhat unique, so I cover, as you'll see in the bottom left hand, Latin America and the Caribbean. But because IFC and the World Bank and the New York investors are here, there is a bit of a global remit as well. As the logo suggests on the lower right, we work with a number of institutions. This is certainly not comprehensive. I work, like I said, with IFC, IDB Invest, the Development Finance Corporation, which is the US development agency, and FinDev Canada, which I'm sure all of you are familiar. So I wanted to start with the sort of a disclaimer that the views that I'm expressing here today don't reflect the Government of Canada position on climate and US policy or climate finance. That really actually happens out of Ottawa, and those goals that we'll start to see throughout the year coming up to COP26 will slowly come out of the appropriate parties within Global Affairs Canada. So my role, as I mentioned before, as a climate finance trade commissioner, I interact with a number of policymakers within the US government, as well as the international finance institutions. And the US climate finance policy, international climate finance policy, is a fairly significant shift in US policy, which is obviously being spearheaded by the Biden administration. So I like to start with this slide. And this slide, sorry, I'm just gonna pull up my notes. This slide, it was actually on the cover of The Economist. And so what you see in this picture is the world's average temperature for every year since the mid-19th century. And the picture itself tells a story. So you'll see that it's been massively, the temperature or global temperatures have been accelerated significantly in the last 20 years. And this is what is precipitating the climate change and the call for no more, not going above 1.5 degrees Celsius. 2 degrees is really sort of that edge. So we're all aiming for 1.5 degrees. But this is sort of a really good picture as to, how quickly we have come to the point where climate change, attention to climate change is needed, climate adaptation, climate mitigation is needed, and of course, the financing to back it up, so climate finance. So let me briefly go through what modern US climate policy has been. So in 2015, President Obama pledged to cut US emissions 26% to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025 as a part of the Paris Agreement. US still hasn't reached that goal yet, but this was sort of the ambition behind the Paris Climate Agreement. Of course, this changed under the Trump administration. Sorry, I'm just trying to move this. And so where he had stated that he will quit the Paris Agreement in a sharp turn toward fossil fuels and America First policies. The turn toward coal and the turn toward fossil fuels was very much aligned with the Republican Party stance toward green energy and new energy. So after President Biden was elected in 2020, he took office in January 2021 and issued a number of executive orders. And one of those orders was to rejoin the Paris Agreement. And he did that actually on his first day of office. He also followed up with a number of executive orders asking the different agencies to be prepared to present on climate finance and climate change in the coming year. There was a deadline of 90 days for Treasury, for example, to put together or coordinate the development of the international climate finance policy, which is available online. And that all sort of happened around, that all sort of happened around in April, where new pledges were made new pledges were made for 50 to 52% emissions reductions by 2030, and then introduce, like I said, a climate finance plan. So out of that April 22nd meeting, which brought together global leaders, including Prime Minister Trudeau and a number of the leaders of the countries that are sort of the greatest emitters and developed countries that are the greatest emitters of GHG or greenhouse gases. The US made the following commitments. So like I said, 50 to 52% reduction in US emissions by 2030. And that will be achieved through sort of whole of government approach, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but it's really sort of landmark that there's been, and quite significant, that there is a concerted effort among the different agencies to come around the climate goals for the US and achieve some of those goals. So part of the commitments were also doubling annual public finance to developing countries, which is what my work focuses on, relative to the latter half of the Obama-Biden administration. And this includes 3 times as much funding toward adaptation finance. If when you look at mitigation finance versus adaptation finance, at least finance through the MDBs or the, again, multilateral development banks, you'll find that a significant amount goes toward mitigation. And there isn't enough going to adaptation. And there's a number of reasons for it. In my opinion, one of them is that mitigation is easier to measure than adaptation. So to create an infrastructure that will adapt to hurricanes or adapt to weather changes, you can't really see a clear return on investment on that. So it's harder to sell to investors. So it's highly dependent on grants and softer capital. But definitely that's something that needs to change, because we're already at that point, as we saw in the previous graphic, that we are sort of needing to both mitigate but then adapt to the climate change that's already occurred. And so as a part of this, Canada and US announced the Greening Government Initiative, which they both co-chair, and looking at a clean energy usage going into 2050. And that includes 100%, and this focuses on what the government can control. So real estate and sort of the investments that these institutions can make. So it's going to increase the resilience and mitigate emissions from national government operations and real property. Includes using used clean energy sources, moving to zero emission vehicles, and greening their procurement and pursuing green and resilient infrastructure. And there's an interim target of 40% reduction by 2025 for federal facilities and conventional fleets. So basically, part of this is going to be looking at how these government vehicles that you see, at least here in Washington, Many of them will actually end up being electric vehicles to lower the carbon footprint of the US government. So that brings me to the US International Climate Finance Plan. And there are 5 pillars to this plan, which I'll go into a little bit detail. So the first pillar is scaling up international climate finance and enhancing its impact. In order to do that, and as I'll go into a little bit later, there's going to be a very big dependence on using the NDBs and the development finance institutions to achieve that goal. Mobilizing private finance internationally. Clearly, and it's obvious, not only in climate, but just in development impact overall, public money can't do it all. It really takes private financing to do. And so there needs to be a significant leverage effect. And recently, it's been quite flat, and there just needs to be a lot more leverage around it. So the coordination efforts that I had mentioned earlier will play a significant part in doing that. Ending international financing for carbon-intensive fossil fuel-based energy. So that's pretty self-explanatory. We find that Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, is shifting, as well as IFC and IDB Invest, to invest into clean energy infrastructure and solutions and not look at fossil fuels. There are some cases, and it is outlined in the Climate Finance Plan, where there has to be a weigh the impact and the effect on the developing country on what the transition looks like. And so in some cases, particularly in the most vulnerable and poor states, that transition wouldn't happen in the short or medium term. Making capital flows consistent with low emissions and climate resilient pathways. I think that's also very important. It sort of comes back to what private financing is, but we're looking at sort of the institutional investment, where Treasury can play a role in this, in creating regulations. And then defining, measuring, reporting US international climate finance. So that's also obviously really important, because it provides the transparency needed for people to feel confident in the plan. And again, going back to point number 2, mobilizing private sector finance. So looking at the first one, like I had said, scaling up international climate finance will largely be through the different institutions where the US has a large presence. So DFC obviously is the development finance institution of the US, but we also see, as I'll mention a little bit later, the US and Canada have significant shares in the World Bank Group, IDB, and others. So DFC, the commitment they've made is actually quite a significant commitment compared to the predecessor institution, which was OPIC. 1/3 of all new investments starting in FY23 must have a climate link. And I think that's also quite important to note, because it's a shift from prior administrations, and it provides a demonstration effect to the private sector. And of course, all of these development finance institutions collaborate with private investors. So this will help private investors feel a little bit more confident in climate investments. They've hired a chief climate officer and a deputy chief climate officer to really spearhead all of this. In addition, they put out calls for proposals for renewable energy projects in developing countries, which I think closes soon, as well as looking for fund managers as well. And you'll find those RFPs on the Development Finance Corporation website. And then they've committed to $50 million in technical assistance over 5 years for climate. Technical assistance cannot be understated. The role of technical assistance cannot be understated, because that is where you get a lot of funding to get projects going, or put design funding in for maybe a new blended finance fund. So it's sort of put money at risk, but at a strategic risk with high likelihood for impact. So the Millennium Challenge Corporation adopted a new strategy they implemented in April, or over 50% of the program goes to climate-related funding over the next 5 years. So this goes through the compacts that they've negotiated with the different countries. And they also have a coal-free policy across their investment portfolio. So really getting away from that fossil fuel and coal dependence which emit a number of greenhouse gases. So the Department of Treasury, they are just like you would find in Finance Canada. They have board seats at the World Bank, IDB, and others. So they will use those board seats to develop climate standards and to instruct these institutions on how to invest for climate finance. They also sit on the board of the Global Climate Fund, the Global Environment Fund, and a number of other funds that on lend or will lend in collaboration with the the MDBs. And they will focus on adaptation finance. Each of these funds have a different role and what they focus on, but trying to use that leverage to emphasize the climate angle. And finally, well, not finally, but USAID will release ahead of COP26 a change strategy for climate. They'll deploy in-country resources focused on climate and explore disaster risk financing initiatives. So this is where blended finance can play a role. The other institutions within the US government, like Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, Department of the Interior, all have their own, all have mandates around climate as well. Of course, EPA does as well. So you'll see that there's a sort of concerted effort, but these were the four that sort of stick out and most significant for international climate finance. So looking at the second role, public finance alone, like I said, won't solve the climate problem. So you need to leverage the private sector, which has been pretty flat, to be very honest. For example, in 2019, MDBs, with the US as a member, committed $36.6 billion in climate finance and mobilized additional $43.7 billion, including $22.5 billion from private sources. So that is significant, it is good, but I think we want a better than a 1-to-2 ratio when you're looking at how you leverage public finance to get private finance. So how do you do that? Blended finance and de-risking funds, USAID and MCC will increase their blended finance activity. This complements, of course, the blended finance activity you'll find at IFC, IDB Invest, and the other institutions where the US and Canada play a role. Canada, as you may know, has the Canadian Climate Blended Finance Fund with IFC and, with IDB Invest, and the Canadian Climate Fund with IFC. Providing technical support to governments, including public-private partnerships. Of course, that's very important to build the capacity of the governments. And that goes to the third point there of how do you build the capacity within the country of the local private sector, civil society, and government to use finance. So you want to be able to ensure that there's an absorptive capacity to take the finance and use it effectively. And of course, then creating policy environments to facilitate private sector climate finance. For those of you that are more interested in this, I actually hosted a virtual climate finance roundtable last week, and those recordings will hopefully be available soon. And you'll find that I've interviewed a number of people from the US government and the Canadian government and the MDBs on all of these issues and the role of technical assistance, blended finance, etc. And the trade, US TDA, or Trade Development Organization, sorry, I don't remember the acronym right now, also will play a significant role. So they'll leverage relationships with existing financial providers, which they have significant relationships, and really try and get US capabilities and Canadian capabilities to developing countries. And those capabilities obviously are around renewable energy, energy efficiency and storage, and use those to export. This is pretty straightforward. Like I said, end official financing for fossil fuels. That will be really spearheaded by Treasury. And they'll also work with OECD and some of the other export agencies to reorientate financing away from carbon intensive activities. Okay. DFC will also implement a net zero emission strategy to transition its portfolio to net zero emissions by 2040. That, of course, like I said before, is aligned with the overall strategy, and that will be spearheaded by the new climate chief officer and the deputy climate chief officer. And this graphic here just sort of illustrates where we are and why this aspect is so important, because you'll find that a number of companies have set long-term goals for to reducing GHG emissions. But as you'll see in the red, orange, and sort of dark orange, that part of that circle graph is really where we're meeting or exceeding the Paris NDCs. The rest are either not disclosed, not aligned, or not assessed. And that really needs to be improved so that we get to the 2% or 1.5%, sorry, 2 degree or 1.5 degree scenario that we're looking to achieve. So making capital flows consistent with low emissions, climate resilient pathways. The G20, US will use its G20 presence on the Sustainable Finance Working Group, and I apologize for the background noise, will develop an initial climate-focused sustainable finance roadmap. Also work with the Financial Stability Board, as well as IMF and others, to work on climate-related data in financial standard setting bodies to assess climate risk, financial risk. So this, all of this, I mean, you even look at where there are coalitions done voluntarily in the private sector, the Treasury will engage and support these coalitions to work on targets. And we see this already happening, you know, around April, right before the April 22nd summit, there was a summit leader with financial leaders. And we find that, you know, through ESG reporting, that is sort of now being required and integrated into the institutional plans of these financial groups, is sort of aligning with this. And how do you get organizations like JP Morgan and others to reach that net zero emissions in their portfolios? So defining, reporting, and measuring impact. Like I said, it's very key to transparency and driving private capital. I took this text from Holland and Knight, and who did a really good analysis on this. So through this measure, looking to create reports that are clear, accurate, and consistent, and coordinating around agencies to do that. Emphasizing climate flows, to see where results are achieved through US climate finance, particularly around small island developing states and least developed countries, which are actually taking the lion's share of the burden of climate change without contributing as much to it. So it's really unfair to them, and we need to start supporting them. And of course, with minority groups, indigenous people, women and girls, and other affected communities. And then encouraging departments and agencies to track the amount of US development finance has been screened for or made resilient to future climate risk. So what is the conclusion here? What is the opportunity here? As we see, President Biden said, we know what we need to do, we just got to do it. So like I said, taking a whole of government approach, which is significant, and indicating their commitment to climate finance internationally by having these coordination activities. The Treasury, for example, is coordinating the board around this, and I know that the different agencies meet quite a bit on achieving these goals. This overall means that there's an opportunity for project developers in the US and Canada. Just as a side note, DFC will actually look at Canadian projects and bankable projects, because they no longer have the US Nexus requirement that their predecessor OPIC did. But this is a good opportunity for investable projects to work with different agencies within the US to reach those goals. The MDBs will play an increasingly critical role in deployment of climate finance. With this plan, we already see that the World Bank, for example, and IFC has over, I think 35% of their portfolio, or approximately 35% of their portfolio is related to climate. And the same goes for IDB Invest. And leveraging the seats that I mentioned earlier, this will only, I believe, increase. And to be quite frank, what wasn't as investable 10 years ago is very investable now. You look at solar, for example, no longer needs that support or subsidy to the extent that it used to get deployed. So we're finding that climate business is slowly coming to business as usual, which is sort of the goal. And then adaptation finance is underfunded and will be a focus of this plan. Like I said, it is significantly underfunded, and I have a graphic on that if we want to explore it in the Q&A that sort of shows this. And the plan, of course, is written by the US government, but is really dependent on foreign governments and private investors, because everyone needs to buy into this. And the US is using its demonstration effect to start this, but it's building the capacity in country and the willingness in country and the willingness among the private sector to get this going. And finally, this plan, it needs to be approved by Congress in the federal budget. I think it's a total budget ask of, I want to say 3.6 billion, sorry, 3.6, 10 billion for clean energy innovation, 7 billion for research, and it sort of goes on. So with that, some of the resources that you can look for specifically on this plan are the climate finance plan, which is available on the White House website. There's a really good congressional hearing where representatives or senior leadership from the US Treasury, Development Finance Corporation, and others testify to Congress on climate finance. And I think it's a very good overview. And we'll provide you those links in this. And then the Understanding Climate Finance podcast, that's a podcast that I host out of Washington, where I do short form interviews, so 20-minute interviews or less, with the different investment officers, the development finance institutions. That will also later on include policymakers and others. But I think it gives you a good overview on the priorities of these institutions. So I highly encourage you to listen to it. Last week we released one on blended finance from IFC. In the week before, we actually interviewed the chief investment officer from FinDev Canada. So with that, thank you. I know we'll move over to Matt, and then we can go through any questions.
Thank you very much, Faheem, for your presentation. We just have Matthew back, so I will allow Matthew to have the floor. Thank you for your patience, and there you go, Matthew.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, and my sincere apologies for the technical issues which seem to have affected us, but here I am. So you've obviously heard Faheem speak to you already about about some of the recent changes that have happened in the United States. But I think that it would be good for you to understand what we understand by climate finance and why it is that it is considered so important, particularly in international trade. As many of you know, about 2/3 of Canada's GDP is tied to international trade, and climate finance is consequently a bigger part of international trade flows in general, and international trade and investment. So why do we care about climate finance here in the Trade Commissioner Service is something that I would like to be able to just to explain to you, and especially explain to you how it is that we define it. So if we start off with the next slide, then we have a definition of climate finance that we have. But before we get into this, the reason why it is that we brought in Faheem here, even though Faheem is based out of Washington, is because I want you to get into the right mindset, which is that triangulation is absolutely everything. If you want to do business in South America or Latin America, Caribbean, you have to do your business development somehow through Washington, through the United States. There's a lot of financing that goes through there. There are large engineering, procurement, and construction management firms who are based out of the United States and you work in the Americas, and more often than not, is that you'll just find that it's easier for you to do some of your business development in the US and then work in Latin America than just going straight into Latin America. We've noticed the same in Africa, for example. You want to do your business, you want to do business in Kenya, you're going to do your business development in Istanbul because the Turks just dominate around there. So with that mindset, with the idea that you're going to be doing your business development in a third market before going into this more difficult market, we can move on to the next slide where I actually define climate finance as is defined by the Trade Commissioner Service. So grosso modo, what it refers to is any kind of financing that goes from developed to developing countries to help these countries do one of two things: adapt to climate change or mitigate climate change. Now, what do we mean by mitigation and adaptation? That is actually on the next slide, which is that mitigation would be anything that you do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which are polluting and changing the climate. But because we also recognize that even if you were to shut down all emissions tomorrow, the climate will still change. Unfortunately, there's been so much pumped into the atmosphere that that's always going to happen. So you also need to have funding towards adaptation. And I define here what adaptation is. But you'll just see, for example, a renewable energy project is something that's very easy to conceive as referring, like say a solar park, for example, whereas the adaptation might refer more to, say, better farming practices with the changing climate, or say building up seawalls and flood barriers. There may be some overlap between the both, right? So for example, the construction of a run-of-river dam to manage increasing floodwaters may also generate power. So there is definitely some overlap between here. Most of the money that we're seeing is in mitigation. It's a lot easier to build a bankable project from a solar facility, from a renewable energy facility, than it is to build one from a seawall. Seawall doesn't generate revenue. A solar facility generates revenue. But even it is worthwhile noting, though, and it's he probably alluded to while I was disconnected, there is an increasing amount of funding that goes into adaptation. For every dollar that the government's put into adaptation, you save yourself $6 in long-term costs. So there is a way and an attempt to make this more bankable. How bankable this becomes, we don't know just yet, but quite frankly, a lot of money is going to go into adaptation. Then my next slide, I discuss who are the major firms who typically access climate finance. And generally speaking, most Canadian firms are going to be within that middle row, which is the service providers. A project developer is going to be the one who takes care of it from beginning to end. More often than not, Canadian firms are going to partner with these project developers, and it's going to be service providers who partner with the project developer, who becomes the contractor of record on a large-scale project. There might be some, say, procurement opportunities. So the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank might give out a tender for a very, very specific service, such as a feasibility study or whichever else. But when we speak of climate finance, and specifically the private sector window, more often than not, service providers are going to be working with a project developer. There's also technology providers in there, but again, more often than not, they'll be working through a service provider or a project developer to access that climate finance. If we go on to the next slide, it's worthwhile noting that no matter what the difference between all these firms, they do what we call the 6 Ps of success: partnerships, positioning, persistence, professional experience, proposals, and price. Partners, as I mentioned, most Canadian firms are going to be within the service providers part. Most Canadian firms are SMEs. There are very few Canadian equivalents of someone like, say, AECOM or Enca Impresi or Salini Costruttori or any of these big EPCM firms who typically access multilateral funding. So always partner. Right? If you're going to be going into a place like Eastern Africa, you're going to be partnering with a local partner, and there's going to be a transnational partner. Similarly, in South America, Brazil, for example, you have to work with a local partner. It's always going to be working that way. How you position yourself as well is important, because what is your value added? Are you just any other run-of-the-mill firm, but you have like a cool technology? Have you specialized in a specific field or emerging field? That is something else that allows you to get your head above the rest. Be persistent as well. any market that you work in, you have to show that you're committed to the market and that you will be working in that market for a long time. In a market such as India, which is a market that I know rather well, you have to be there for several years. You have to show that you are interested, that this is not just a one-off that you're going to be going to this country to do a project in, but that you are committed to that market for the long term. And that persistence will then allow you in the long term to develop that professional experience. The professional experience is key because when people are successful in accessing transnational finance, it's typically people who have that experience. I believe that there's Econolaire on the call right now, and Econolaire is one of those firms who we often cite as ones who have that professional experience and have been known to do rather known in these, at very least within the halls of the World Bank, because of the experience that they've had in foreign markets, particularly in African markets. Getting the professional experience gets your name out there. And once you've been persistent, once you have that professional experience, that's all well and good, but you got to make sure that your proposals are well and clear. When someone is looking at your proposal, either for a simple bid for a tendering opportunity or a proposal that you bring forward, it has to be clear. What is the advantage to the bank to fund your proposal? What is your return on investment? All of that must be absolutely clear. And one thing that helps in any good proposal is to make sure that you have a good price, that you are competitively priced. Very tough for Canadian firms to be competitively priced, I'm not going to lie. There are quite a few issues with, because of the fact that we don't have the, say, funding programs that other countries might have. But one thing that we always tell Canadians is that if partnering with a larger firm may often help you with that price. So that's why we consider these 6 Ps to be a bit of a circle. And I will, if you can move on to the next slide, please. Yes. So I kind of mentioned there's and Faheem has alluded to this as well, the difference between the public procurement and the private sector window. What we really focus on in climate finance is in the private sector window. So the public procurement is a more straightforward process when you work with a multilateral development bank, where they issue a tender, you as a firm then respond to the tender, you give your bid, and you work with the trade commissioner in Washington, D.C. to ensure that your bid goes through and that you are helped from A to Z. Where we tend to focus on in the climate finance world is in the private sector window, i.e. where you as a service provider, project developer, or you as a service provider working with your project developer partner, have a project, it's ready to go, you have your site, you have everything, you have some notional agreement with the local government, you have some form of your own funding, but you need that extra funding from, say, the private sector window of a multilateral development bank. Moving on to the next slide, I have a few examples of where this private sector window would be. Next slide, sorry. There we go, yes. So it would be, there's the Inter-American Development Bank, has 2 windows for the private sector that you may be able to speak to, where you basically pitch your project to receive that funding to fund your project to be able to develop it in the long term. Again, someone like Faheem is the person who you would speak to. So if you're looking at something like, say, IDB Lab, which is more for, say, people with an interest in technology, or the IDB's Invest, where you're looking for equity investment into your project or company, Faheem is the one who has those contacts and who would be able to connect you over to these people to eventually do some kind of a pitch. We, from headquarters, actually have a number of resources, which you can see on the next slide. Because before you speak to Faheem, you may also be interested in just a whole whack of info. And if you go on the website that is on this slide right here, we'll be able to link you over to some fact sheets, to a list of funds. You may, for example, not want to necessarily speak to Faheem. You may, because you're interested in, say, Asia. Well, we have someone over in Manila. We have someone over in Abidjan. We have someone over in London who deals exclusively with private funds and European funds, which invest in emerging markets. We have all of that info that can be found on this website right here to be able to help you out to give you that information before you take the leap into going internationally. But even before you speak to Faheem, once you have into this information and you think, hey, this might be right for me, I would highly recommend that you go to the Quebec regional office, because this is this is the CCMM rather. You actually have an office dedicated to you in Quebec, which you have the information on the next slide. So it's right over in Place Bonaventure. Before times, you could just easily walk there, but obviously now with it being closed, it's all virtual. But if you think you're ready to export and you have not already spoken to the Quebec regional office, speak to them. They'll be able to assess your market potential. They'll be able to link you with qualified contacts, not just the people like Faheem, but for any of our offices around the world. The Trade Commissioner Service has offices all over South America and Latin America. We have offices in many parts of Africa and in Asia. And before you reach out to these places, our pitch is speak to the Quebec regional office. They are there to help you. It is a free service offered by the government of Canada. They will be there to help guide you as you decide to expand your business internationally. So with that, I think I'll just turn it over to Nicolas. Thank you very much, everyone. And if there are any questions, we'd be glad to answer them. And that would be it.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Faheem, as well, for both of your presentations. We will move to the question period. So please feel free to write them down in the Q&A box that's located in the bottom center of your screen. So that's Q&A. So we will just wait some few seconds for the participants to write them down. Okay, there you go. In the meantime, I will have some short questions on my side as well for maybe the both of you. As a Canadian company with minimal climate finance experience, Matthew, what's the best way for me to access climate-related funding, for example?
Well, generally speaking, if you are someone who has a certain amount of international experience, I would say the best way will be through our contacts, right? So if you think, hey, I'm looking for some kind of funding for this project that I want to, for example, again, we'll get back to a renewable energy project that I would like to be able to develop in, say, Panama, for example. The first step should be familiarize yourself. Always familiarize yourself with what the funding that exists out there. So in the link which I provided, we have a list of funds who are investing in that region. So once you familiarize yourself with the funds that exist out there, it helps you kind of narrow things down for you. But before you actually start to speak to these funds, right, what these funds want to know is, one, is your project viable? Is it a real thing? Have you done your work on the ground? Have you even spoken to the local authorities? Is there buy-in? If it's all just conceptual and anything like that, it's probably not the right time to approach the fund. I'd say a better time to be approaching the fund, or to be approaching someone like Faheem, is once you have done a bit of that groundwork a little more. Have you identified a partner? Have you identified, again, like your site, have you spoken to anyone in government? So which is why I mentioned that, your real process should be, first of all, speak to the Quebec regional office. Then once you have an idea of what you want to do, speak to the trade commissioner in the market you're interested in, right? We have, you want to work in Colombia, we got an office in Bogota. You want to work in Panama, we got an office in Panama City. And only then, once you're ready to take it to the next level to try to find some of these funders, then speak to our climate finance trade commissioners. And in the case for Latin America, it would be Faheem.
Okay, thank you very much for all the details, Matthew. I appreciate it. We have a question from Jean Paquin asking, is there any funding available for sustainable aviation fuel endeavors? Faheem, would you like to maybe to...
Through IFC and IDB Invest, I don't know. The short answer is I'm not sure. there is latitude because, when you're looking at it at clean fuel and supply chains, that there will be some consideration there. It's not high on the priority list. It's not like clean storage or energy storage or the other sectors where they've put a lot of emphasis, but I'm sure that if it's a viable investment project, they would look at it. But like as Matthew said, there has to be a bankable project, and at least from the IFC, IDB Invest, DFC perspective, it has to be an investment that would take commercial capital. So the availability of concessional capital or grant capital isn't something that you would really depend on.
Okay, thank you. We also have a question from Abiba Koenig, who asks, if I want to develop 20 megawatts geothermic electricity for a village, where will I start?
I can field that one, and Faheem probably has something to add. But generally speaking, where do you want to start is, it all depends. What is the village that you have found? The first thing you want to do, obviously, is familiarize yourself with the laws in the country, right? On like investment laws, anything like that, before you take the leap. Try to get your buy-in at the local level. Try to get your buy-in at then the higher levels in government within the country. Work with a trade commissioner who is on the ground there, even if you're just in exploratory talks, right? But you have just started speaking to people in this village, and you're interested in developing the project there. Alert the trade commissioner, the nearest trade commissioner, as soon as things start getting serious, because that way it allows them to start doing some of their own groundwork, to be able to reach out to some of their own contacts that they have federally, for example, or at the sub-federal level, to be able to help you out as you start doing your permitting process. For when you approach for funding, I think Faheem would be better placed to explain that one.
Yeah. I think, Matt covered most of the aspects. You need to know, for any sort of electricity project, it's important to have an off-taker agreement already in place, or at least starting. That would require the public-private partnerships on the ground, partnerships with the government, making sure that this is really demand-driven. My observation with energy projects is that it's investable when the demand is coming from the government itself, or from the village itself, and then that's when you can start leveraging both sovereign funding that's sort of lent from, let's say, the World Bank, or DFI funding, where there's an investment part of it.
Thank you very much, Faheem and Matthew, for responding. We have now a question from Antoine Tremblay, who has a question for you, Faheem. In your view, are there strong public commitments in the US to co-invest or stimulate investments in technological solutions that will allow the US to generate green electricity on the massive scale needed to significantly reduce the US carbon emissions? That's a pretty elaborated question.
Yeah, I think there is. So, one of the other agencies that's sort of party to this climate finance initiative is the Department of Energy, where they are looking to fund new innovations around, let's say, EV, electric vehicles, and new technological solutions. The second most significant part of the budget, and I'll try and pull it up. Oh, I don't have it here. Was to NOAA. So, which is sort of the research part of this, in research and innovation part of this plan. So yeah, there is not only there, but then when you look at that 50 million technical assistance facility that I mentioned, that's really where you can go a little bit more upstream, and into the SMEs and into earlier stage.
Thank you very much. Faheem, we still have some time left. We have less than 6 minutes, but I wanted to go back on something you mentioned that I find very interesting. What about adaptation and adaptation investing? I think you mentioned before closing.
Yeah, let me see if I can share my screen quickly.
Oh, sure. You can just go share it above what you're seeing.
Well, let me share unless you let me.
Oh, okay.
But as we're bringing that up,
you can maybe share now.
Okay. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes, that's great. Thank you very much.
All right. So let me put this a little bit. As you'll see here, these are the climate finance flows in 2018 from the different countries, and then sort of looking at the sovereign, and then how they're distributed. So the intermediaries. The significant part, let me see if I can.
We can see just right.
So if you look here, can you see my mouse?
Yes.
The adaptation part was only $30 billion, whereas the mitigation part was $537 billion. And dual benefit was about 12. And the large amount of adaptation went to waste and water and to disaster risk management, whereas the cost of the of disaster and the disaster risk is monumental. So this is where you're starting to see that there needs to be a greater shift, not to lower the mitigation number, obviously, but like I said, mitigation is becoming, like renewable energy is becoming much more bankable than it used to be, whereas a lot of attention needs to come to adaptation.
Okay, I understand there. The risk mostly come from what is used to mitigate all the risk coming from the climate finance, right?
Yeah, so you're sort of mitigating by lowering the amount of GHG you're putting into the atmosphere. That's really where mitigation sort of comes in. So you have transport, energy efficiency, but adaptation, at least the way that I see it, is okay. We're already at that point. So how do we survive? That's where the survival part of it, and where mitigation is more the preventative part of it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Faheem. I just want to let the participants know that on June 16, Faheem, you should be back with us as well. This time regarding the international financial institutions, but this time it would be the IFC, so the Finance Corporation. I think I will do the closing now. Thank you very much to all the participants. We are now at the end of the question period. So as a reminder, I will send you a follow-up email tomorrow with the slides. Once again, I invite you to complete the survey that will be sent as well. It's very appreciated. We'll also make the video recording available on our website next week. Thank you again to Faheem and Matthew for your excellent presentation. It was really a pleasure for me to have you, the both of you here today. Thanks as well to the participants for joining us today and engaging in the question period. On behalf of the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal, I wish you all a good day and hope to see you at our next event. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.